Americans adapted one type of submarine to their every need, and I felt Japan should have done the same. Another basic defect that led to tinkering was the lack of a strong working relationship between what we might call the operators and the engineers. In fact, in Japan, a great barrier actually existed between those two groups. In America, civilian scientists and technicians were brought in to assist with strategic planning. They were then able to develop weapons and techniques to meet changing situations. For instance, building small escort aircraft carriers on merchant ship hulls, and constructing great numbers of destroyer escorts instead of a limited number of destroyers, which were more costly. Destroyer escorts did not have to be as rugged and powerful as destroyers. In Japan, the military operators simply laid down requirements for certain weapons and equipment, then handed these to the civilian engineer. Some of the requirements were not technically feasible. Others were just impossible. Many included demands for speed in fulfilling them that just could not be met. The civilian engineer had little reason to give much thought to what use the weapons might have, and little knowledge of how they actually served in battle on which to base improvements. He had no chance to originate suggestions. It took all of his energies just to produce what was demanded. Radar was the outstanding example of this poor relationship. Our engineers were so engrossed in keeping up with operator demands that they had no chance to maintain the level of electronic knowledge the American engineers could. So when radar was suddenly demanded of them, they could produce only crude, unreliable systems, at least 2 years behind those of the US in efficiency. In the spring of 1944, however, I could not spend too much time worrying about that. My submarine was scheduled for completion in the summer. I had to have my crew ready, so I heaved myself into that task as May began. The campaign for the Marianas also opened in that month, a struggle that would just about break the back of Japan's submarine force. In 3 months we were to lose more boats than in the entire first 18 months of the war. Chapter 15. The Marianas Campaign. Construction of I-47 was not completed until July 10, 1944. During the final phase of her construction, I learned that some of the things promised me in Tokyo would be forthcoming. I-47 was off the ways before I got them, but workmen installed an air search radar set of the Mark 13 type, plus a schnorkel. The breathing apparatus was an older model, inferior to what the German U-boats were using at that time. As for the radar set, my engineering officer, Lt. Kikuichiro Tokuzawa, had to give up his sleeping space for installation of the control panel. The enemy troops had leapfrogged General Adachi's positions in New Guinea, and his forces were ill-fed and sickly. He had no naval support. By May 1st, our High Command had written New Guinea off strategically. Adachi's orders were to hold on as long as he could and make it as costly as possible for the enemy to get past him and into the Philippines. Our combined fleet commander, ADM Soemu Toyoda, had a big problem handed to him when promoted to the top post. He had to answer a vital question: where would the enemy strike next? Like Koga, Toyoda wanted to husband his naval strength until he could meet the enemy in one decisive battle. His plan for this battle was called Ego. It called for waiting for the enemy to commit himself somewhere in strength, at which time our surface forces would rush out from the Philippines and Singapore to add their weight to attacks made by our planes. With MacArthur enjoying success in New Guinea, it was thought that the next point of enemy attack might be the Philippines, or it could be the Marianas, now that Nimitz had the Marshalls secured and could jump off from them. To find out what the enemy was doing, Vice ADM. Takagi was ordered by ADM, Toyoda, to set up a submarine sentry line across the path the enemy would take moving north from Australia toward the Philippines. In addition, 6th Fleet was to send submarines into the Marshalls, where we knew the Americans had some of their aircraft carriers. Takagi sent I-10, I-38 and RO-42 eastward. But since the greater danger, and closer one, seemed to be MacArthur, Takagi sent 10 submarines down to an area north of the Admiralty Islands. These were I-41, I-44 and I-53, supplemented by 7 medium-type submarines. As we shall see, the smaller boats did little more than provide excellent targets for the proficient American destroyer men, whose anti-submarine warfare skills were improving rapidly. The 7 small submarines were RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-109, RO-112, and RO-116, all completed since the war's beginning. Sending these boats south was not only one of the war's tragic tactical errors, but it also threw strategic moves off. The boats were skippered by men not long out of submarine commanders' school. They had been ordered to the Indian Ocean almost immediately after graduation to give them some seasoning and increase the effort in that area. But when an attack from the south seemed likely, the 7 were suddenly switched to the Pacific. 5 of them were lost within a few days. On May 1st, the enemy attacked Ponape in the Carolines. 4 days later, Jaluit, in the Marshalls, was hit. On May 15th, another leapfrog landing on the north coast of New Guinea was made, and on the same day, an enemy carrier force suddenly appeared behind one of our major defences, the Malay Barrier, the islands through which one must pass when heading for Singapore and the Orient from the west, and launched strikes against our holdings on Java. This shocked the High Command. It gave evidence of the enemy's growing strength, that he could hit places so widely separated from one another. On May 15th, the only submarine we had that was equipped with radar, I-44, left Cure for her sentry work in the south. The radar set was defective, and I-44 was nearly sunk by air attack while relying on it. She suffered severe damage on May 21st and had to retreat. Up until that time, I-44 had been the anchor of an 8-boat sentry line north of New Britain and New Ireland, with I-44 at its northeastern end. The rest of the line ran to the southwest in the following order: Row 106, Row 104, Row 105, Row 116, Row 109, Row I-12, and Row 108. There were about 30 miles between boats. At this time, Admiral Koga estimated that the enemy had 5 powerful task forces at this disposal, each one including aircraft carriers. There was at least one in the Marshalls, one near New Guinea, and reports had come in on 3 others in the Carolines. However, Toyoda had no idea where any of them would strike. The main thrust could come across the Pacific from the east, into the Marianas, or it could come up from New Guinea, against Palau and the Philippines. A single American destroyer escort, USS England, catapulted Toyoda into making a wrong decision. On May 16th, our submarine I-16 departed Truk with a cargo of supplies. Her captain, Lieutenant CDR Yoshitaka Takeuchi, was supposed to take into Buin, Bougainville. Takeuchi was sighted by an American plane. 3 U.S. destroyer escorts, England, George, and Raby, were sent up from the southeastern Solomons to intercept him. 5 days after leaving Truk, I-16 was picked up by England, steaming in a sweep with her sisters. The destroyer escort attacked and sent I-16 to the bottom. Our 6th Fleet had now come up against the deadliest enemy it ever met during the war, Lieutenant Dr. Walton B. Pendleton, and the 200 men of his crew, manning a ship that was about half the size and firepower of our own first-line destroyers. That was USS England. The 3 enemy ships continued sweeping westward and missed I-44. This boat was later attacked and damaged by another force. The trio did discover RO-106. Lieutenant Iyasu Uda had taken this boat out of Truk on May 6th. On May 22nd, he was lit up in the glare of enemy searchlights after trackers got him on radar. When one of her sisters missed, USS England sank RO-106. The advice of myself and other submariners had not been taken. Our submarines had not been scattered as we suggested, and we had also urged that they not be arranged in sentry lines. So, moving further west, the American ships found the next boat in line, ROI 04, that same day. She had left Truk on May 17th under Lieutenant Hisashi Izubuchi and survived the first attack made upon her. But the following day she was found again. All 3 American ships attacked RO-104, but it was England who got her, the the third kill for this light-hulled ship in 5 days. The next submarine in line was RO-105. She must have been submerged where radar could not find her and outside of sonar range because the 3 ships passed her, missing her. They found RO-116, though. What I had warned against during my table pounding at Truk was happening. The enemy ships had come across the sentry line and were steaming right down it, getting one sentry after another. RO-104 was discovered less than 24 hours after RO-116. American accounts tell that England got Lieutenant Takeshi Okabe's boat, which had departed Truk on May 6th, and that USS England's captain was beginning to feel embarrassed at winning all the glory while in company with other ships. He became even more embarrassed 2 days later, when England killed off RO-108, the boat of Lieutenant Kenichi Obari. RO-108 had left Truk with RO-116 and lived only 36 hours longer. Again, the crew of USS England carried out what was becoming a familiar task. It took them only one attack to get this boat. By this time, the air was full of jubilant American messages about Japanese submarines being sunk one right after another. Our intelligence people intercepted all, decoded some, and realized that our patrol line was in danger. A warning was broadcast. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakagawa, commanding RO-109, and Lieutenant Toru Yuchi, who had RO-112, did not wait for instructions. Both at once changed position, taking up new stations about 100 miles to the northwest of where each had been. This took them out of the sweeping path and saved their boats. Meanwhile, word of these submarine losses got to ADM, Koga. It made him assume they had been sunk by the advance screen of an enemy task force that was proceeding north. When RO-108 was lost, the combined fleet commander was almost positive, but he became certain on the last day of May, when the 5th submarine in the sentry line, RO-105, went down, that an attack on the Philippines from the south was imminent and prepared his forces to meet it. He sent no ships eastward. RO-105, the 6th submarine to be sunk by USS England in 12 days, had left Truk on May 17th under Lieutenant Junichi Inoue. It took a lot of killing to sink it. The England force was joined by other ships, including an escort aircraft carrier, and they found Inouye's boat on May 30th. He successfully dodged their attack, but was found again the next day. England scored again. The days of May were also deadly to 3 other Japanese submarines. RO-45 went down on the first day of the month at a point only 20 miles south of Truk. Just 20 miles. It seems hard to believe, but it is true. Latte Kuda Yoshihisa Hamazumi had been at Truk when aircraft carriers attacked the atoll. He was sent to pursue them and headed out. The US destroyer McDonough detected RO-45 the following day. Attacks by this ship, USS Potter, and a plane sent Hamazumi and his men down. Lieutenant Dr. Sadatoshi Norita had been a passenger in Kinashi's I-8, taking a crew to Europe for the purpose of bringing back the 2nd submarine Germany was giving us. He and his men completed 6 months of training in his new excellent boat and, on April 30, Norita took RO-501 out of Kiel, Germany, and headed for the Cape of Good Hope. He was supposed to give a position report at 30N 37W. On May 11th, he reported having passed that location 5 days earlier. He was not heard from again. Post-war reports show that Norita fell afoul a type of vessel that was to be called by American writers the scourge of the U-boats. This was the American escort aircraft carrier, a ship built on a merchant hull and used extensively against submarines. Cruising with destroyers or destroyer escorts, these ships closed the broad gap in the Atlantic Ocean's centre that could not be reached by shore-based planes trying to protect convoys, an area that German submarines earlier found so full of fruit. The escort carrier USS Bogue left Norfolk, Virginia, in the first week of May. During the second week, one of her escorts, USS Robinson, found and sank RO-501 in the Atlantic Narrows, that section of water between Recife, Brazil, and Dakar, Africa. Buka still had some of our troops on it in May, and they had to be supplied, so CDR Hideo Okada left truck in I-176 with a cargo of supplies for them. The killer of USS Yorktown at Midway was sighted by aircraft, just as I-16 was to be a little later, and 4 destroyers were sent to get her. USS Haggard, Franks and Johnston chased I-176 for nearly 24 hours after making contact with her on May 15th on the east side of New Ireland. Many dozens of depth charges sank Okada's ship, as if to mock ADM. Toyoda, on May 27th, Japan's Navy Day, the enemy chose to attack Biak Island, northwest of New Guinea. His force was reported to contain 2 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. That made the commander-in-chief certain that the enemy intended to jump from Biak to Palau and the Philippines. He ordered the 1st Air Fleet, our carrier force, to move down and crush the enemy, pulling planes out of the Marianas for this purpose. He also ordered the 2nd Fleet, which included the giant battleships Yamato and Musashi, to stand by for a rush to the south. These were based at Tawi-Tawi, our anchorage in the Sulu archipelago, at the tail of the southern Philippines. Toyoda was still busy deploying his forces when, on June 5th, one of our land-based planes from Nauru Island flew over Majuro in the Marshalls. This daring long-range flight resulted in a message that read, "At Majuro, apparently ready to sortie, are 14 enemy aircraft carriers, 6 battleships, 14 destroyers, 4 tankers, and about 20 cargo ships." This caught Toyoda out of position because he was still working up to an all-out counterattack on Biak, but he still believed that the Philippines was the enemy's next objective. Perhaps it was because he believed that MacArthur, a man whom our top leaders knew to be greatly sensitive to his person and position, was eager to keep his promise of returning to the Philippines. In any case, Toyoda ordered the battleship cruiser force at Tawi to start southward to Halmahera from where it could strike into Biak. Our 6th Fleet commander, Vice Adm. Takagi, moved from Truk to Saipan in the Marianas to have a better location, Truk being endangered, from which to direct our submarine operations. Again, no ships were sent eastward. Toyoda kept his carriers at Tawi and waited for the situation to develop further. Contact with the enemy force from Majuro was lost on June 9th, and Toyoda had no idea where it was heading. Meanwhile, an American submarine, scouting off Tawi, sank 3 of our destroyers in 4 days. This was excellent submarine work by USS Harder and her captain, Sea Dr. Samuel Dealey, who certainly deserved having a ship named after him later. The loss of 5 sentry-line submarines had given Toyoda the impression that a task force was sweeping up from the south. And the sinking of 3 destroyers right off his main anchorage, plus the sinking of a 4th destroyer and 3 tankers not very far away, plagued him further. Toyoda had to move his carriers out of Tawi soon. Otherwise, they'd either be sitting ducks for attacking American planes or be trapped inside a ring of enemy submarines. On June 12th, the carriers were still at Tawi and Toyoda's heavy surface ships at Halmahera when an enemy task force suddenly appeared off the Marianas, sending in planes to hit Guam, Saipan and Rota. But Toyoda felt this was merely a diversion, an attempt to draw his forces away from the southern Philippines so that MacArthur could land on Mindanao. Toyoda thought so little of the attack on the Marianas, in fact, that 6th Fleet sent only 3 submarines, RO-36, RO-43 and RO-114, to that area to counter-attack. The 3 boats were to operate east of the Marianas. All other submarines were to concentrate in the Carolines and in the area north of the Admiralties. On June 13th and 14th, reports came from Saipan and Tinian that enemy battleships and cruisers were bombarding them, while aircraft were bombing. On June 15th came word that American Marines were landing. What Toyoda had thought was a lure was actually the vanguard of a mighty force containing more than 125,000 men. Toyoda ordered Operation Ago put into motion at once. It was actually an excellent plan. and it might have worked except for two things: the bright mind of American Admiral Raymond Spruance and American submarine men. The first battle in the Philippine Sea is called by the Americans the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It might just as easily be called the Great Submarine Success, if looked at from the American point of view, or the Great Submarine Disaster, if looked at from the Japanese side. First of all, we lost those 5 submarines on the sentry line. A 6th, I-44, was badly damaged. Then the American submarines Harder, Puffer, Gurnard and Bonefish sank 7 of Toyoda's ships, and when Toyoda finally gave the order for his carriers to leave Tawi-Tawi, the American submarine Redfin sighted them that very day. Vice Adm. Jisaburo Ozawa had our aircraft carriers. He was sighted and reported when passing through the central Philippines, and again when emerging from San Bernardino Strait. USS Flying Fish sighted him there. Meanwhile, Vice ADM. Matome Ugaki had left Halmahera with Yamato, Musashi and other heavyweights, his attack on Biak having been cancelled. The American submarine Seahorse sighted Ugaki's force, and the enemy knew our ships were coming. Spruance sent fighter sweeps northward into the Bonins and Volcano Islands to knock out aircraft there, thus eliminating air counterattack against him from land bases for at least a few days. Then he stood by to await the arrival of our carriers and battleships, and before his aircraft carriers had a chance to attack ours, 2 American submarines scored great victories. USS Kavala sank our carrier Shokaku, and USS Albacore sent carrier Taiho to the bottom. After that, Spruance's pilots wiped out more than 80% of Ozawa's flyers. Our underwater enemies chewed at the combined fleet before it sortied, reported it when it did, then smashed 2 of its most important fighting units before the main battle was even joined. What had been pre-war doctrine for both the American and Japanese submariners had been executed in a classic manner by our enemies. They did everything right under Vice ADM, Charles A. Lockwood's direction. Our submarines, under Toyoda's and Takagi's direction, did everything wrong. Operation Ago called for land-based planes to attack the enemy's ships, land in the Marianas, rearm and refuel, then strike again on the way back to home bases. Our aircraft carrier planes were to do the same thing: strike the enemy, refuel and rearm in the Marianas, then strike again on the way back to their carriers. Operation Ago was, therefore, intended to give our air forces twice their striking power. Spruance and American submarines wrecked Operation Ago. Our land bases were temporarily neutralized and our land planes made ineffective. Loss of 2 carriers meant loss of their planes while still out of range of the enemy. The remainder of our air power, sea-based, was overwhelmed by the waves of planes from Spruance's undamaged carriers. And when the battle was finally joined, where were Japan's submarines? Completely out of the picture, believe it or not. When fleet forces met fleet forces, our nearest submarine was many hundreds of miles away. None was in the Philippine Sea. So sure was Toyoda that the enemy attack would be against the Philippines, thanks to USS England's accomplishments against our submarines and the submarine Harders against our surface ships, that our submarines at Kure, Yokosuka, Saeki Bay, Truk and Palau received no orders from him until June 16th. By that time, communications with Vice Admiral Takagi on Saipan had been temporarily cut off, and Rear Adm. Noboru Owada, heading Subron 7 at Truk, had to take over command of the 6th Fleet for a while. He ordered 12 submarines to form 3 sentry lines. I-6, I-185, I-184, I-5 and I-41 were ordered to take station in that order about 300 miles east of the Marianas on a north-south line, with I-6 the northernmost boat. Parallel to that line, and about 80 miles east of it, was to be a chain made up of RO-47, RO-42, RO-41 and RO-43. Another 150 miles east of this second line was to be a third, also parallel, made up of I-10, I-38 and I-53. Owada also ordered 8 other submarines to deploy in waters closer to Saipan. These were RO-36, RO-109, RO-111, RO-1I2, RO-13, RO-114, RO-1-15, and RO-1-17. On June 16th, an order came down from Toyota's flagship in the Inland Sea that all Japanese submarines were to remain east of the 145th east meridian of longitude. The First Battle of the Philippine Sea took place west of that, so the order kept our submariners well away from where they might have done the most good. The order was rescinded on June 20th, but by that time it was too late. The major damage to our fleet had already been done. The enemy no longer feared our aircraft carriers, which were fleeing. His own carrier planes were available for heavy attacks on our island garrisons and for intensified anti-submarine patrol sweeps. From Truk, on June 17th, Admiral Owada gave orders for the 8 RO-type boats near the Marianas to begin making attacks on the 19th against ships in that area, but they were still limited by the order to remain east of the 145th meridian, which cuts between Guam and Rota. Saipan and Tinian were in the allowed area of attack since they lie east of that meridian. But 4 of our submarines were sunk before the date of attack arrived. RO-36, under Lettepi's CDR Tatsuya Kawashima, had just made a supply run from Kure to Truk and returned home safely. On June 4th, she left Saiki Bay, Kyushu, with more supplies. This time her destination was Wewak, New Guinea. On June 10, the U.S. destroyer Taylor, operating with an escort carrier and 3 other destroyers north of the Admiralties, sank a submarine. Since the submarine broached after being depth-charged and was actually seen in mid-afternoon by American sailors, I assume it was RO-36 that Taylor sank. We had no other subwarines in that area at that time. Another boat left Saiki Bay the same day. This was Late CDR Naozu Nakamura's RO-111. He had orders to sail for Saipan. I think that Nakamura's boat is the one sunk about 100 miles west of Saipan by the U.S. destroyers Melvin and Wadley, which got her on radar at midnight of the 15th. RO-36 could have been in that area because the 145th Meridian order had not yet been sent when the American ships made their contact. The third submarine lost was RO-117 under Lieutenant CDR Yasuo Enomoto. He left Truk on June 5th, heading north. On June 16th, he was ordered to take station northeast of Saipan and was still working his way into position when an American heavy bomber flying anti-submarine patrol out of Eniwetok, in the Marshalls, sank him. RO-114 left Saiki Bay under Lieutenant Yoshihiro Ata on June 4th to patrol in the Marianas area. She was never heard from again. I think she is the submarine sunk on June 13th by the destroyer Melvin, east of Saipan. This ship got a radar contact not long after midnight, closed in, illuminated, and opened fire. RO-114 Dived but was sunk by depth charges slightly north of the patrol position assigned to here. During the campaign for the Marianas, we sent a total of 26 submarines there on various missions and lost 11 of them. American and Japanese records disagree as to the times and places some of them were sunk. Having made a careful study of the missions assigned, positions assigned, dates of leaving port, plus the dates and positions from which last heard, I am sure that my accounting of the lost submarines is the most accurate one available, especially since official American accounts were written and published long before many valuable records were unearthed in Japan and elsewhere. There is no disagreement, however, on the 2 submarines we lost in the Marshalls during this period. They were RO-42 and RO-44. Lieutenant CDR Mochitsura Hashimoto gave over command of RO-44 to Letter CDR Sadao Uesugi just before it left Kure on May 15th for Saipan. From Saipan it went on to the Marshalls and checked on enemy activity around Eniwetok. After a second scouting of Eniwetok, RO-44 headed for Bikini. On June 16th it met up with the destroyer escort Hastings at about 3 a.m. Uesugi and his men died not long afterward. By then, RO-42 had already been lost. She left Kure the same day as RO-44 and went straight to the marshals, from where she sent back situation reports. On June 10th, she appeared on the radar screen of destroyer escort Bangust, east of Kwajalein, a little before midnight. Lota Yoshinosuke Kudo and his crew never saw another dawn. After a while, Rear Adm Kuwawada passed the command of 6th Fleet on to Vice Adm Shigeyoshi Miwa at Kure. This happened after Awada had given 2 more general orders. On June 19th, he ordered all available submarines to make attacks in the Saipan area. The next day, Admiral Koga's limiting order was rescinded, giving the boats freedom of action. But it was then too late to help our combined fleet, which had retreated. On June 22nd, Owada ordered all but 6 boats to pull out of the Marianas area. I-6, I-38, I-53, and RO-47 were to continue to attack when and where they could. I-10 was to make for Saipan to evacuate Admiral Takagi and his staff. I-41 was to head for Guam, where many pilots and airmen whose planes had been destroyed on the ground waited. The Naval General Staff wanted them brought back to Japan so they could fight again. Nakajima had to get I-10 in past more than 100 ships and get Takagi out. I cannot account for the sinking of I-10 on a specific date, but I am sure she was lost no later than June 28th and most likely to an enemy plane. American sources list her as being sunk on July 4th. I cannot agree, mainly because Admiral Miwa had already given her up for lost by June 28th, the date on which he ordered I-38 to take over I-10's mission. Only 1 submarine appears to have had any good fortune during the Marianas campaign, and even she did not achieve positive results. Lieutenant Hisashi Watanabe took RO-115 out of Kure in mid-May with a cargo of supplies. He stopped at Truk, then Wewak and Palau, after which he was ordered to move in close to Saipan. On June 19th, he was west of Rota and fired 4 torpedoes at a Wasp-class aircraft carrier. That exhausted his offensive capability, and he returned to Japan. No American carrier was reported as receiving torpedo hits on that day. On June 22nd, the pilots and airmen at Guam were picked up by I-41 and taken safely to Japan. Lieutenant Sea Doctor Mitsuma Itakura brought off this coup after a strange plan was abandoned. I have already mentioned that Itakura made a much-needed supply run to Buin, despite the danger, when he could have gone back to Japan for a special mission. His was the last Buin run made. Itakura then rendezvoused with I-36, I-38 and 3 other submarines in the inland sea, south of Kure. Someone had conceived an idea nearly as weird as the wooden torpedoes Hashimoto had been ordered to test, supposed to carry amphibious tanks from Kure to Bougainville and put them ashore. The tanks were equipped with, of all things, torpedoes. They were to go ashore, make their way overland, go into the water near the enemy beachhead, and make a torpedo attack on enemy ships. This would be called the Tatsumaki Tornado operation. The submarine captains were astonished to think that anyone was really serious about this new thing. First, submarines would have to get in near Cape Torokina, which none had been able to do so far. Then they would have to surface in this perilous area for at least 20 minutes to get the tanks away. That is, if the tanks' motors would start after being underwater for so long. Then the tanks would have to reach land safely, cross it, and enter the sea again. They made a monstrously loud noise and could only achieve a maximum speed of 4.5 knots. Were enemy sailors supposed to sleep through all this din while these creeping caterpillars closed in on them? The project was finally abandoned. I think it was laughed out of existence. Itakura was then sent to the Admiralties as a sentry during the period when USS England killed off 6 of our submarines. He sighted nothing, and nothing sighted him. I-41 was ordered into Guam and evacuated 106 men from there, putting them ashore at Oita, Kyushu, near Beppu, on June 30th. Itakura then went to Kure, where he received orders to help establish a Khitan organization. On the same day Itakura evacuated the pilots in I-41, we lost another submarine, Lieutenant CDR Junarai's I-185. She was en route from Kure to Wewak when ordered to intercept the enemy instead. On June 22nd, Arai spotted a convoy near Saipan, bringing in reinforcements for the assault on that island. But the convoy's escort also spotted I-185. Destroyers Newcomb and destroyer minesweeper Chandler sent Arai's boat to the bottom. Another diverted submarine, I-184, had been sunk 3 days before that. On May 20th, the boat of Lieutenant Dr. Matsuji Rikihasa left Yokosuka with supplies for Mili, an island whose story is one of the war's saddest. Counting the troops who fled there from Majuro in January, over 4,500 men were marooned on this tiny island. For 20 months thereafter, they were subjected to bombing and shelling by passing ships and planes, even providing an occasional bit of target practice for new American units just arriving in the combat area. Except for the meagre supplies a few submarines took to them, this garrison had nothing. Over 1,600 men died from starvation and from sicknesses brought on by lack of food. Another 900 succumbed to enemy attacks. The rest were all serious hospital cases at the time of final surrender. Rikihasa arrived at Mili, unloaded his supplies, and left there on June 12th. On June 15th, he received word to close in on the Marianas. Before he could get there, a Grumman torpedo plane from the escort aircraft carrier USS Suwannee downed him with depth charges. I-6 was one of the boats that Adme Zawada, while temporarily commanding the 6th Fleet, had told to stay in the Marianas area when the other boats left it. On June 30th, she fired torpedoes at an aircraft carrier only 10 miles east of Saipan. I think that later Shozo Fumon retreated after that attack and waited for a chance to strike again. On July 4th, a group of American escort carriers and tankers was east of Guam. Part of their screen located a submarine that evening. Destroyer escort Riddle and destroyer Taylor made a depth charge attack and reported sending it to the bottom. I am convinced that it was I-6. No American sources are correct on the other 3 submarines lost in the June-July period of the Marianas fight, I-5, I-55, and RO-48. Luther CDR Takeshige Doi left Truk in I-5 on July 6th for a supply run to Ponape in the Carolines. He got there safely on July 11th, unloaded, and made for Truk. 3 days later, Doi radioed that he was attacking some enemy ships about 300 miles east of Saipan. We never heard from him again. The ships he attacked were a group of hunter-killers, especially searching out submarines. The destroyer escort Wyman sank I-5 after Doi's ship had been picked up on radar in the darkness. 3 different submarines tried to tow Unpoto to Guam to help our beleaguered forces there. Sea Doctor Toshio Kusaka left Kure on June 27th with I-26, and after many attempts to pierce the anti-submarine defences unsuccessfully, finally got through them and unloaded his cannon carrier on July 7th. Then I-45 and I-55 were sent to try, leaving Yokosuka on July 7th. Chased off several times by alert enemy patrols, I-45 had the misfortune of seeing her Unpoto washed overboard in heavy seas. She had to return to Japan. This was the second piece of bad luck for I-45 in a short period. On her previous mission, to the Marshalls, she had been bombed and heavily damaged by an enemy aircraft. The sub barely made it back to Japan with a wrecked stern. Sea Doctor Monshiro Izuzu had I-55. He also kept trying to get into Guam with an Unpoto. Finally, word was sent to him to abandon his mission and head for Tinian, where airmen waited to be evacuated. Izuzu cast loose the Unpoto and acknowledged this order late on July 13th, saying he expected to arrive at Tinian on the 15th. He must have been still sending this message when an American plane sighted I-55 about 80 miles west of Saipan. An ambush was laid, and the destroyer escort Miller picking up I-55 on radar next morning. Miller was still making depth charge attacks when her crew heard a great explosion. It was I-55's death cry. RO-48 was the 11th of our submarines to be sunk in Marianas operations. She left Kure on July 5th under Leterser de Aseta Kazutomi. On July 14th, she reported undergoing a severe depth charging only 30 miles east of Saipan. It was the last message received. I think that Kazutomi limped away from that attack and tried to make battle repairs. Then, shortly before sunset on July 28, a hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier USS Hogat Bay found RO-48. Destroyer escorts. Wyman and Reynolds sank her quickly. After being raised at Truk, refloated and towed home, I-33 was refitted. Lieutenant Mutsuo Wada was given command of her, and in June was giving refresher training to his crew in the inland sea, as well as shakedown training. On the 13th at 8:40 a.m., Wada ordered a sudden dive. I-33 did not come to the surface again until 9 years later, when it was salvaged and the bones of Wada and 89 other submariners recovered. The reason for the sinking of I-33 was the same as that for the sinking of USS Squalus in 1939, the American submarine that was recovered and refitted to fight against us as USS Sailfish. The main induction valve had not closed. This is the opening through which submarines of that period breathed while running on the surface. It had to be closed when they dived. If not, a great column of seawater poured into the submarine, weighing her down. USS Squalus was found, and the McCann diving bell was used to rescue those of her crew who were still alive. In the case of I-33, she was located, but we had no method of saving her men, even though they were in only 180 feet of water, a much shallower depth than Squalus. Wada and his crew must have suffered awfully before suffocation finally brought them death. I-52 was lost in the Atlantic. She had gone there under Sir Dr. Kameo Uno, carrying a cargo of rubber, tin and tungsten. She met a U-boat off Biscay Bay, but no report of her arrival in Europe ever got to Japan. After the war, we learned that I-52 was the victim of airborne radar and a weapon called the sonobuoy. The sonobuoy, when dropped into the water from an aircraft, acted both like a sound detection station and a radio station. Its sonar portion established the range and bearing of an underwater object, and its radio portion sent this information to aircraft in the sky. 3 aircraft from the U.S. escort carrier Bogue discovered, depth-charged and sank Uno's boat on June 24, 1944. In July, we lost a submarine to a British submarine. I-166 was summoned east from the Indian Ocean, so Lieutenant Siddhartha Shoichi Nishiuchi took her out of Penang on July 16th, heading for a rendezvous with fleet units off Singapore. I-166 was ambushed the following night by HMS Telemachus. Nishiuchi, fortunately for him, was on the open bridge when the enemy's torpedoes hit. I-166 sank from under him. He and a few others were picked up by a friendly craft in the Malacca Strait. I-29 was sunk by a submarine also. Under Sea Doctor Takaichi Kinashi, the ace of our submarine fleet, she had gone to Europe. Kinashi brought his boat back safely as far as Singapore, loaded with machine tools and other valuable devices for our war industry, plus new weapons. He departed Singapore for Kure on July 22nd. 4 days out, he was sunk by USS Sawfish, south of Formosa. Some of I-29's crew survived, but Kinashi did not. He went down with his ship. Organized Japanese resistance on Saipan ended July 9th. Admiral Takagi and his staff had perished 2 days before that in a Banzai attack. Vice Adm. Chuichi Nagumo, who had led our aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, at Midway, and in the Solomons, committed seppuku on Saipan at that time. Tinian men continued to fight as units until Aoguma won, and Guam, after being pounded by enemy ships and planes for a month, was invaded on July 21st. The Marianas were lost and the Tojo cabinet fell. At Kure, late in July, our new commander of submarines, Vice Adm. Miwa, held a conference to study what had happened to our boats in the 12 weeks since the Naval General Staff had handed down preliminary orders for Operation Ago. Those captains who had been badly battered by the Americans and barely returned to Japan alive had plenty to say. They pointed out that 9 of the submarines lost in the Marianas had been pulled out of the Indian Ocean, were manned by men just out of submarine school, or both. Captains of such submarines, they said, had no knowledge of the latest American developments and techniques in anti-submarine warfare. Lt. Hisashi Watanabe, CO of ROI-15, was most vehement. He attacked the Kure school staff for adhering to obsolete curricula and making no change in their approach to tactics. "These people are too slow in developing means for use against the enemy," he said. Rear Adm. Keizo Yoshimura, Chief of Staff to Admiral Ozawa, who commanded our aircraft carriers in the Philippine Sea battle, was caustic in his reply to Watanabe. "In the Marianas battle," he said, "the American submarines performed brilliantly. Where were Japan's submarines? What were they doing to help us?" Watanabe would have none of this, even from an officer so much senior to himself. He and his friends had fought too hard. His tongue was just as sharp as Admiral Yoshimura's as he answered, "You know very well, Admiral, that Admiral Toyoda himself ordered us to stay out of waters that were expected to be the battlefield. Therefore, you must know very well why we could not meet and strike at the enemy." Having gone this far, Watanabe felt that he might as well go all the way. "Before criticizing us submariners for supposedly having failed you," he said, "you may first reflect on the defeat of your own air and surface forces and on how well American submarines were able to perform against you. If our submarines are to enjoy any degree of success in the future, you will have to stop underestimating the ability of men the enemy sends against our submarines. It is excellent. You think of nothing but the clash between 2 great surface fleets. You completely ignored us and the men who fought against us." After that, there was a great commotion in the conference room, but Watanabe had made his point. Had our submarines been ordered west of the Marianas, we might have been able to make inroads on the enemy's strength, just as his submarines had been able to slice away a great deal of ours. We might have avenged the carriers Shokaku, Taiho, and Hio, which were lost in the Philippines sea battle, and the enemy might not have then been able to turn the full force of his power against Japanese submarines, the only sea force that opposed him in the Marianas after June 20th. Everyone began shouting opinions, charges, and countercharges when Watanabe finished talking. Nothing could be resolved, and the meeting adjourned on an angry note. It was some days before a new policy was drafted and a statement issued. I learned of it while putting I-47's new crew through shakedown training. In summary, the Sixth Fleet's new policy was: 1. Because of the small number of submarines now remaining, sporadic, separated fleet attacks will not be made. Submarines will operate en masse, attacking enemy forces in conjunction with our air and surface forces. Until the enemy has approached nearer to Japan, our submarines will remain in home waters, refitting and undergoing extensive training so as to achieve maximum capability. 2. Submarines especially designed for transport duty are now being completed in rapid succession, one after another. They will increase the frequency of our supply missions to the defenders of our Pacific outposts. 3. Kaiten are now being built, and Kaiten pilots are now being trained. A number of submarines will be assigned to Kaiten operations. When the US Fifth Fleet smashed Ozawa's carrier force, it wrecked all chances of Japan's ever mounting enough naval air strength to score a decisive sea victory. Our island air strength was also in pieces, and although we could still manufacture aircraft at a high rate, we did not have the time to turn out high-caliber pilots to man them. The combined General Headquarters, Tokyo, admitted to the loss of only 1 aircraft carrier during the May-June period, while claiming to have sunk 1 battleship, 3 cruisers, 1 destroyer and 1 submarine, and to have sunk or damaged more than 5 enemy aircraft carriers. The truth, however, was that our navy in the air, on the surface and under the sea, had suffered what was very nearly its death stroke. Our hope now lay in a desperate measure. At last, 2 years after Hiroshi Kuroki and Sekio Nishina first thought of their human torpedo, the weapon that might roll back the sky, it was accepted. Word came down from the Naval General Staff in June to rush ahead with mass production of Kaiten and to commence training men to man them. I, Zenji Orita, would have much to do with this weapon. Chapter 16. Special Supply. Submarines. The Philippines. Kaiten. I had almost finished the final phase of surface shakedown training with I-47 and was about to commence the underwater phase when the Americans assaulted Saipan. My submarine was not ready for battle yet, so I concentrated on 3 months of arduous training. Things were quiet for the 6th Fleet in August and September, as nearly all boats were being held in Japanese waters for a major effort. We lost no submarines in August and only 2 in September. One of these was engaged in supply operations. The big B-29 bombers had been appearing over Japan since June, but our submarine construction program was not interrupted. I-362 was the first submarine of the I-361 transport class of submarines to be completed. She was finished on May 23rd and was followed by I-361, May 25, I-364, June 14th, I-363, July 8th, I-365, August 1, I-366, August 3, and I-367, August 15. These boats had no torpedo tubes. A pair had been built into some of the first ones, but sea tests showed that this arrangement caused an enormous bow wave when cruising on the surface, easily detected from a great distance. The tubes were removed, and the length of the boats increased 6.5 feet to fair out the hull line. The original conning tower was also altered, from the Japanese traditional block shape to a sort of cup shape, narrower at the bottom than the top. Some of these I-361 class boats served as underwater tankers, carrying gasoline home to Japan, and some never got into transport work at all. They were assigned to the Kaiten squadron upon completion. The first of these boats to leave Japan on a supply mission was I-362, which left Yokosuka for Nauru on Aug. 21, carrying 80 tons of food. Later CDR Enosuke Nakajima got his boat to Nauru safely, then made for Truk. He got back to Yokosuka on Oct 3, with 83 planeless airmen as passengers. That had become an important function of our submarines, bringing back airmen to man the defences of our homeland. Next transport submarine out was I-361, leaving Aug 23 for Wake with 80 tons of goods and bringing back 30 evacuees. Then it was L-364's turn. LTCDR Takeo Makino set out with another boatload of supplies for Wake, but never got there. He left Yokosuka on September 14 and was sunk that very same day by the American submarine Sea Devil, which was lurking outside Tokyo Bay. The Americans were hitting the Western Carolines often by that time. On Sept 15, enemy Marines landed on Peleliu in the Palaus. Palau had been the headquarters of our South Seas administration ever since Japan had been given a mandate over Pacific Islands by the League of Nations. The Americans wanted the Palaus for a base to cover their planned invasion of the Philippines. The Allies had abandoned Formosa and the China coast as objectives by this time. It had been decided to take the Philippines, then islands between the Marianas and Tokyo, with a final assault to be launched against the Japanese homeland from Okinawa, after it, too, had been taken. RO-47, under Lieutenant Nagao Ishikawa, tried to counterattack the enemy amphibious force off the Palaus. Leaving Kure on September 18, she was sunk 8 days later by the destroyer escort Reynolds. Hedgehogs got her. With Hedgehogs, a destroyer could track at slow speeds, get a submarine on its sonar and keep it there. It could stand off, calculate target position precisely, and fire Hedgehogs. These missiles made no noise if they missed, so the destroyer's sonar remained effective during the attack. If a Hedgehog hit and exploded, it registered well on sonar, and also punched a serious hole in the submarine's hull. Once a Japanese submarine was located by an American ship armed with Hedgehogs, Its life was usually measured in minutes. Once a hedgehog hit, depth charges could finish the job easily. By Augnadosa 10, all organised resistance on Guam came to an end, although some surviving men would hold out there for many years, refusing to believe, even long after the war ended, that Japan had been defeated. A Kaiten base had been set up on Otsujima Island in Tokuyama Bay, Yamaguchi Prefecture. Its commanding officer was Letito Sector Mitsuma Itakura, who had served well in submarines. The chief instructors at Otsujima were the Kaiten's co-inventors, both of whom had been promoted, Lat Hiroshi Kuroki and Lati Jeiji Sekio Nishina. About 24 men were being trained. A lot more would be needed as Kaiten came rolling off assembly lines, so the Naval General Staff set about getting them. Volunteers were sought at 2 naval air training bases, Nara, not far from Otsuka, and at Tsuchiura, northeast of Tokyo. A total of 200 were wanted, 100 from each base. Petty Officer Yutaka Yokota, with whom Mr. Harrington has written a book telling the story of Kaiten, was a member of the 13th Flying Class, numbering 2,000 men. On Aug. 25, 1944, he and his comrades were assembled before the main hangar at Tsuchiura and addressed by Captain Kenjiro Watanabe, commanding officer of the base. "It grieves me very much to tell you this," said Watanabe, "but the news from our Navy comrades on the front lines is not good. The difference between our power and the enemy's grows ever greater. In spite of the gallant fight our countrymen make, Saipan is in enemy hands, and we are having great trouble supplying our forces at Rabaul and other outposts." Then, without telling what it was, Watanabe revealed that Japanese technicians had developed a weapon of overwhelming strength and asked for volunteers to man it. He warned the student pilots beforehand that it was a no-return weapon, causing a gasp to go up from the ranks. This was the first more or less public mention in Japan of a Toko weapon that was actually designed to be a Toko weapon. The public had read many accounts of men dying in last-gasp heroics, even early in the war. Several Americans, in fact, crashed their aircraft into Japanese ships when they were already shot and dying, and wanted to get in a final blow at their enemy. The well-known kamikaze were not organized until 2 months after Captain Watanabe's speech. Yokota was one of those who inscribed 2 circles on a piece of paper, signifying eagerness to volunteer. Men volunteered in such numbers that they had to be screened. No married men were taken, which eliminated a number. Yokota, 19 and single, was one of the 100 accepted. 3 days later he entrained for Kure, where he took a boat to Otsujima. There were 30 men already in training when he arrived. Yokota and his comrades were given an introduction to the new weapon and began at once attending classes on its construction, maintenance, and control. I may as well say at this point that Kaiten had no escape device, as mistakenly stated in the American naval history of the war. That work says there was a device in each Kaiten to throw a Kaiten pilot clear while he was still short of his target. It is true that when the Naval General Staff first gave its permission to build Kaiten, it was on condition that such a throwing device be included. But during manufacture and testing, it was decided that this would interfere too much with design. At the strong urging of Kuroki and Nishina, it was eliminated. Later Kuroki, co-inventor of the Kaiten, died at Otsujima on September 6, when his weapon took a sudden dip and struck the bottom of Tokuyama Bay. This cracked a hole in the giant torpedo. It flooded, drowning Kuroki and the man who was riding tandem with him, Later Takashi Higuchi. The weapon was later recovered, and both men cremated. Nishina vowed to carry Kuroki's ashes with him on the first Kaiten mission. I helped Nishina keep his vow. From my submarine, I-47, the first human torpedo was launched in combat. 8 days after the Americans landed on Peleliu, they put army troops ashore at Ulithi in the Carolines. They met no opposition because our troops on Ulithi had already moved to Yap. By then, my old ship, I-177, was 4 days out of Kure under Lieutenant Masaki Watanabe, heading for the Palaus to hit the enemy there. The commander of Subdiv 34, Captain Kanji Matsumura, was on board. I-177 was sunk on Octia 3 by the destroyer escort Miles, part of the hunter-killer group. 3 other submarines sent to the Pallas, RO-41, RO-43 and RO-46, got back to Japan safely. Enemy aircraft carriers carried out heavy attacks on the Philippines and Formosa in early October. On Oct. 11, a task force that included 17 carriers, 5 battleships, 15 cruisers, and 58 destroyers, struck at Okinawa and other islands of the Ryukyu chain. Those areas were considered a part of the Japanese homeland. An attack there could not be tolerated for fear of its effect on our civilian population, so Adam Toyoda told Vice Adam Miwa that an all-out submarine attack should be made on this roving enemy fleet. The pursuit of it eventually cost us 6 first-line submarines from the 16 Miwa had available. The struggle for Leyte Gulf, in the Philippines, would cost Japan more than 40 warships. When that fight ended, our navy would no longer be a fighting force. From then on, the emphasis would be on Toko weapons and tactics. When Toyoda ordered this all-out submarine attack, our 6th Fleet table of organisation showed that we had 55 submarines. This seems like a formidable force, but let me state that we had 55 boats, only on paper. First of all, 15 of these boats were in use only for training. All were obsolete but RO-500, the German gift. That reduced our effective numbers to 40. But the 7 boats of Subron 11 were undergoing shakedown training, which left 33. Subron 8 was in the Indian Ocean under Rear Admiral Kisao Ichioka. It had 4 boats, I-18, I-165, RO-133, and RO-155. This brought us down to 29 boats, but 7 of these were under Rear Admiral Owada in Subron 7, and all were of the I-361 transport class, without torpedo tubes. Of them, I-364 was missing, so the 55 boats were really only 22. I-12, under Kaneo Kudo, had left for independent operations in the Central and Eastern Pacific, so that left 21. These boats were in Subdiv 15, to which my ship belonged, and in Subron 7. Captain Kiyotake Ageta commanded Subdiv 15. We had 12 boats, but 3 were already earmarked for Caton work, and my boat was one of them. That left only 9 boats for action against the enemy if Toyoda's all-out submarine attack were to be launched, plus 9 more in Captain's Kanji Matsumura's Subdiv 34, and 2 of his boats, I-177 and RO-47, were missing. In fact, Matsumura himself was missing too. So it was that 55 submarines on paper became only 16 that could actually sortie out through Bungo Strait against the enemy. Miwa formed 14 of these boats into 3 groups and ordered them to sortie as quickly as possible. By Octa 15, 4 of them, I-26, I-45, I-54 and I-56 were on their way. On Octa 17, the Americans made landings on the islands at the entrance to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. The enemy's intentions were now clear, so all submarines were ordered to head for Leyte. By Oct. 21, 8 more submarines had followed the first 4 out. These were I-38, I-41, I-44, I-46, I-53, RO-41, RO-43 and RO-46. Then RO-109 left on Oct. 23, with RO-112 following her 3 days later. The battle for Leyte Gulf began on Oct. 23, with American submarines drawing first blood. We had a northern, a centre and a southern force. The northern force was composed of almost planeless aircraft carriers. It was supposed to work only as a lure, drawing the American Admiral Halsey's carriers away from their task of providing air cover to ships off the new beachhead. Once this was done, our centre force of battleships and cruisers was to emerge from San Bernardino Strait and turn south toward Leyte. There it would be joined by our southern force, a group of battleships and cruisers that was rounding the southern end of the Philippines, while the centre force was steaming through the central Philippines. They would form a pincers to crush the American support ships with their vital supplies, fuel and ammunition. Air cover for our forces would be provided from bases in the Philippines. On October 23, the U.S. submarine Dace sank heavy cruiser Maya, and the submarine USS Data sank heavy cruiser Atago, while our center force was beginning its approach through the middle of the Philippines. These two submarines also reported that we had large ships on the move, warning Halsey. Pilots from Halsey's carriers, who had already wiped out most of the land-based Japanese aircraft that were intended to support our combined fleet, hammered away at our center force after that, sinking mighty battleship Musashi the following day. Early on the morning of October 25, our southern force ran into a Surigao Strait ambush, composed of PT boats, destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. The enemy's smaller ships did most of the damage, with 2 of our battleships and 3 of our destroyers going down. More ships were picked off by U.S. aircraft as they retreated from the battle scene. The northern force was a successful lure, all right. It drew Halsey off, but at the cost to us of 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, and a destroyer. Our center force was able to break through and attack enemy forces off Leyte, but all it accomplished before beating a retreat was the sinking of an escort carrier, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort. Halsey, after sinking our carriers, raced to get into striking range of the center force. His planes sank 3 of its cruisers, and during the retreat, American submarines scored 2 more successes. This destruction wrought on our fleet provides the background I must use when placing the operations and losses of our submarines in the Philippines, to show how great a defeat the Americans inflicted on us. I-26 lived for only 11 days after leaving Kure. Her skipper, Lieutenant Shoichi Mishiuchi, hoped to repeat his accomplishments in the Solomons, Indian Ocean, and Australian waters. On October 20, Nishiuchi was ordered to take station southeast of Leyte Gulf. 4 days later, he reported sighting 4 aircraft carriers. One of their screening ships, USS Rowell, sank I-26 before Nishiuchi could attack. Of those submarines we had ranged off the eastern approaches to the Philippines, the second to go down was I-54. Lit Conductor Denshichi Nakayama acknowledged an Oct. 20. Ordered to change his station, but was never heard from after Oct. 23. 5 days later, he was sunk while trying to penetrate a screen around American aircraft carriers. I-54 was detected and the carriers made off, while destroyers Helm and Gridley hunted down and sank this, one of our newest submarines. I-45 was lost the same day. Lieutenant Sea Doctor Mamoru Kawashima sighted a warship early that morning and opened fire, sinking the destroyer escort Eversole with 2 torpedoes. When rescue ships came to pick up the American survivors, one of them found our submarine. It was USS Wilhurst, which sent I-45 to the bottom. Our other submarines, meanwhile, were not idle. Lit Cadet Masahiko Morinaga fired 3 torpedoes from I-56 at the enemy convoy on Oct. 22 and sank 1 cargo ship. On Oct. 25, he was able to locate other enemy ships by his radar. He attacked and radioed he had sunk 1 escort carrier and 1 destroyer, but the escort carrier, Santee, did not sink. Then, on Oct. 26, Morinaga met up with another convoy and reported sinking 3 cargo ships. Out of torpedoes at last, he headed for home, arriving at Kure on November 4. I-41 was Lieutenant Sector Fumitake Kendo's boat. She left Kure on Oct. 19 and scored on an enemy cargo ship 8 days later. Kondo thought he sank an escort carrier and a destroyer on Novthy, and so reported by wireless on Novtyo 12. It turned out later that he had damaged the light cruiser Reno. Down sharply by the stern, this ship had to be towed to the rear area for repairs. Later in the month, the Americans sought to shut off Ormoc Bay, on the other side of Leyte from their first beachhead, so Japanese reinforcements could not be put ashore on Leyte Island from there to join the fight, as we had done from islands in the Solomons. Kondo tried to attack enemy ships in Ormoc Bay on November 28, but a patrolling aircraft warned of his approach. I-41 was sunk by 4 destroyers, Pringle, Waller, Sawfley and Renshaw, Let Sea Dr. Kosaburo Yamaguchi, with whom I had visited Tokyo to make reports during the previous February, left Kure on Oct. 19 in I-46, a new boat like mine. As skipper of I-176, he had sunk an American submarine, but now was after bigger game. Yamaguchi was still searching out targets when, on November 17, he was spotted by a radar-carrying aircraft. USS Taylor, a destroyer summoned to the scene by the airplane, kept attacking until I-46 was sunk. On November 12, we lost another of the submarines sent to the Philippines, although she was not lost in the Philippines area. Lieutenant Kichiro Shimose took I-38 out of Kure on Oct. 19 and patrolled off Leyte and Samar until November 5, when he was ordered to make a reconnaissance of the Ngulu Islands. These lie between the Palaus and Ulithi. Our High Command wanted to know whether the enemy had any ships based in the Ngulu Islands' excellent lagoon. While acknowledging this order on November 7, Shimose did not include any sinkings claims with his message, so I do not know whether he downed any enemy ships after leaving Japan. I-38 crossed the path of U.S. warships that were heading from Ulithi to the Palos on November 12. USS Nicholas detected I-38 with radar in the evening darkness and sank her. There is still much doubt in the minds of former members of the Japanese Sixth Fleet as to how much our submarines actually accomplished in the Philippines campaign. Lit CDR Masao Kimura left Kure in RO-50 on November 15. He claimed the sinking of an escort carrier and a destroyer on November 25, but the official American naval chronology shows no such ships being either sunk or damaged on that date. Yet, as of November 15, our Sixth Fleet commander, Admiral Miwa, officially estimated that his submarines around the Philippines had sunk 3 aircraft carriers, 7 destroyers, and at least 5 cargo vessels. The American naval chronology confirms only the sinking of USS Eversole and the damaging of Reno and Santee. We did get an American destroyer in the Palaus before our submarines went to the Philippines, though, and the incident caused the enemy to sink one of his own submarines. On Oct 3, near Morotai, later Yoshikuni Honda was cruising in RO-41. He put up his periscope and saw an American destroyer, USS Shelton, which he hit with a torpedo shortly afterward. Shelton later rolled over and sank while being towed to safety. RO-41, meanwhile, eluded another ship that was depth-charging her and got away. But an alarm had been raised, and this second ship, USS Rowell, which had come to aid survivors of the Shelton, was called away from Shelton's side by airplanes that had sighted a submarine. Racing to the spot indicated, Rowell kept attacking until the submarine was sunk. It turned out later to be USS Seawolf. We lost one more submarine in November. I-565, under Litte Kadia Moto Nakamura, had made a run to Truk with a load of supplies, and was on the way home when the American submarine Scabbardfish sighted it less than a day's travel from Yokosuka. All hands but one in I-365 were lost on November 28, the survivor being captured by the enemy submarine. On Oct 10, when the Americans bombed Okinawa, Admiral Miwa had 16 submarines actually available for attack operations. By the end of November, he had only 10. In the group to which I belonged, there were only 3 boats left, besides those set aside for Khitan action. In Subdiv 34, there were 7 others, all RO boats. I-12 was still out on a mission from which she would not return. There were another 3 boats soon to join Miwa's active force, but that would give him only 13 to pit against the thousands, yes, thousands, of enemy ships that were converging on our island homeland. Thanks to our planners' inflexible unwillingness to change, and the ability of the American planners to change and adapt, the defeats suffered by the Sixth Fleet in the Marianas and Philippines wrecked it as an effective fighting force. We would fight on for another 9 months with what we had, but with never a hope of victory. Between Aug 21 and the end of 1944, a total of 10 submarine loads of food, fuel and ammunition left Japan for outlying island posts. I have mentioned 3. The fourth was I-363, which left Yokosuka on Oct. 9, for Waleai via truck. She took out 75 tons of food, 5 tons of clothing, 5 tons of heavy oil, and 5 tons of miscellaneous items, returning on Nov 19. I-361 left on Oct. 17 for Wake and returned safely home on Nov 9 after delivering 67 tons of food and ammunition. The 6th transport run was made by I-365, which was sunk on the way home by USS Scabbardfish. I-366 made a run then, from Yokosuka to Pagan Island. She left Deckard 3 with 51 tons of food and brought back 49 passengers on deck 28. I-367 left on deck. 4 for Wake with 81 tons of food and ammunition. When she got back, she was ordered into the dockyard for fitting of kaiten racks. I-363 successfully reached Marcus Island on deck 17 with 108 tons of cargo, mostly food, and got back to Yokosuka with 60 passengers 9 days later. The last transport run of the year began on deck 30, when Lieutenant Kida Yasuo Kamijukoku took I-371 out to Waleai via Truk. I-371 got back to Truk and left there on Jan. 31. She was not heard from again. The American submarine Legato intercepted and sank I-371 on February 24, we learned after the war. Thus did we lose 3 out of 8 special transport submarines to enemy submarines. I was still training my crew in the inland sea when the Philippines fighting started. I-47 was to be ready for battle in just a few days. I was at Yokosuka Naval Shipyard getting final checks and was summoned to Kure soon afterward. There I went on board Tsukushimam for a conference. Attending it were Capt. Kiyotake Ageta, the commander of my submarine division, Latkada Nobuo Kamimoto, CO of I-37, Latsidia Iwao Teramoto, CO of I-36, and myself. We were joined by Sea Dr. Shojiro Yura and Latsidia Kenosuke Torisu of Admiral Miwa's staff. After green tea had been served, Yura gave us a full briefing on the fighting in the Philippines area up to that time. Not a bit of the news was good. In order to turn the tide of war in our favour, Yura said, Combined Fleet and Sixth Fleet have decided to load special weapons, called Maru Roku Kanemono, on board large-size submarines and attack advance enemy anchorages with them. The plan is already underway, and the first attack will be made about the middle of November, using I-36, I-37, and I-47. Without waiting for formal orders, you are to go ahead and make preparations. What, said Kamimoto and I, almost simultaneously, are Maru Roku Kanemono? Torisu joined in and explained that Circle 6 metal fitting was a cover name to maintain high security for a manned torpedo. This was the Model 93, he said, converted to be steered by a man. The pilot will be the torpedo's eyes and steer it directly into a target. Once it is released from a submarine, there is no way to recover it or its pilot. It is a toko, suicide weapon, designed especially for water use. Where are the pilots? Asked Kamimoto. Training at Otsujima, Tokuyama Bay, answered Torisu. Experimental attacks have been made, using I-36. Results have been very favourable, so far. Are the weapons ready? I asked. Kure Naval Arsenal is producing them right now, replied Torisu. An hour later I saw my first kaiten. Its structure and capability were explained to me, and I was told of the young men who invented it. There are times when words just escape a man. As I walked along with Kamimoto a little later, all I could do was fall back on more or less standard statements. Things must be really bad, I said, if we have to resort to this. I agree, he said. The pilots will certainly have to have the Toko spirit, but so will we submarine crewmen, if we are going to help them do their jobs. From that day on, the thought of life versus death rarely left me. While in I-15, RO-101 and I-1-77, I had not once dwelt on the possibility of my dying, and I thought whether any of my officers and men did. I think that all felt as I felt, that they would survive combat, even if every other ship and man in the Sixth Fleet were lost. During training, as well as when out on missions, they always believed that they would make a safe return to port. Now, in my new work, I would be taking to sea men who were determined to die, and I had always felt it my duty, up until that time, not to let even one man under my command die if I could do anything to prevent it. I was going actually to have to order men to die. I would have to direct them into their kaiten and send them against the enemy. I would, in a sense, be an executioner. Also, never before had submariners taken such risks as I was going to have to take. I would have to maneuver closer to the enemy than anyone had so far while he was gathered in great strength. One mistake might mean the loss of my ship and its crew, so I was in a dilemma, having to provide some men the means for death, while at the same time keeping in others a hope of life. It caused me many torturous moments, but I finally came to a solution. My duty was clear. I had to get those kaiten men to their launch points. So, while doing that, I had to put out of my mind any thought of the lives of my crew. After the kaiten were away, I rationalized, I would reassume the responsibility for my crew. The next 3 weeks were busy ones. 4 kaiten racks had been installed on I-47's deck, 2 forward and 2 aft. The weapons were to rest in these, each secured by 4 wire bands. 2 of the bands could be released from inside the submarine's hull, but we would have to surface to release the other 2. In training, off Otsujima, we used torpedo boats and other small craft as our practice targets. Workmen painted the upper half of each kaiten white, so that observers on the target ships could see results achieved by the pilots, each of whom set his depth so as to pass under the vessel he was using as his target. Our pilots trained with us. The 4 who were to go out in I-36 were Leto Kentaro Yoshimoto, ENS, Taichi Imanishi, ENS, Kazuhisa Toyozumi, and ENS, Yoshihiko Kondo. Those to go in I-37 were Leto Yoshinori Kamibepu, Letoish JG, Katsumi Murakami, ENS Shuichi Utsunomiya, and ENS Kazuhiko Kondo. In I-47, I was to have the co-inventor of the kaiten, Letoeke JG, Sekio Nishina. He was a very intense young man, full of courage, determination, and faith in the weapon he and his friend had devised. The 54-foot torpedo could run for 60 minutes at 40 knots, and Nishina often told the men he was training that no warship in the world could outrun it. With Nishina in I-47 were to be Let, JG, Hitoshi Fukuda, ENS, Akira Sato, and ENS, Shozo Watanabe. The senior kaiten pilot in each submarine was a graduate of Etajima. The target given 2 of us was Ulithi Atoll, which had become the major advance anchorage of the U.S. fleet. The enemy had all kinds of ships there, from fleet tugs to mighty battleships. Japanese pre-war strategic predictions were being borne out, but not along the lines Japan's planners had hoped. The Americans were pressing westward from island to island, all right, but we had failed to stop them. At Midway, the Solomons, the Marianas, and Leyte, we had failed to win the one great battle that was supposed to stop the enemy in his tracks and send him home sorely wounded. The enemy had successfully seized our former bases and was using them against us. Just as Kuroki and Nishina had said in their original presentation of the kaiten scheme, we might be able to attack him successfully in those anchorages. The Kikusui mission would tell. About 800 years ago in Japan, there was an emperor named Go-Daigo. Well-read and intelligent, he felt that an emperor should rule, rather than sit in polite, idle seclusion, while the shogun, the barbarian conquering chieftain, whose chief responsibility it was to keep Japan inviolate from invasion, peaceful or otherwise, ruled for him. But when Emperor Go-Daigo tried it, Shogun Takauji Ashigara banished him. There was at the time, however, a brave retainer of Go-Daigo who agreed with his ruler. His name was Masashige Kusunoki. He was lord of the Kawachi district, south of Nara, our ancient capital. Kusunoki raised an army, defeated and deposed Ashigara, and restored Emperor Go-Daigo to his throne. But Go-Daigo then made the same mistake as did King Charles II of England when noblemen brought him back from exile to the throne of his homeland. Instead of rewarding those who had fought and bled for him, Go-Daigo favoured fawning courtiers who had done little or no fighting. So, not too many years passed before he was deposed again. Masashige Kusunoki fought for his emperor once more, but his force of 300 warriors had to face 10 times that many at the Battle of Minatogawa near Kobe. He died in the unsuccessful battle. No emperor ever held any real power after that until Meiji, grandfather of Emperor Hirohito, was restored in 1868. Kusunoki has traditionally been revered as the perfect Japanese model of loyalty to the throne. Our mission against Ulithi was given the name Kikusui, in honor of the Kusunoki family crest. It consists of kiku, chrysanthemum, and sui, water, which combine to make the phrase floating chrysanthemum. The kanji ideographs making up the Kusunoki family crest were painted on the conning towers of all 3 submarines in white when we went out on the first Kaiten mission. Some American writings mistakenly use the word kikusui to describe some of the aircraft Tokko missions. The only employment of this expression in Japan was to designate the first Kaiten sortie. Other sorties had other names. After intense practice, our pilots were pronounced ready. The date for the attack on Ulithi was set for November 20, the date for our departure from Otsujima for November 8. On November 7, we had a visit from Vice Admiral Miwa. He addressed all the Kaiten trainees, telling them how much Japan's hopes now rested on them and the weapon they had chosen. Our largest-sized Imperial Navy flag, with its 8 red rays, hung from a nearby flagpole. The Admiral saluted it and pivoted to face in the direction of Tokyo, whereupon all present bowed very deeply to the distant Emperor. Then Miwa directly addressed the Kaiten pilots who would go out with us. They were standing in a row, wearing their best uniforms. Miwa presented each with a brand-new short ceremonial sword and wished him well. Such swords had special meaning. In the old days they were used by the samurai to disembowel themselves in seppuku, which Westerners usually call harakiri, when they failed their lord in their duty. We threw a big party for our 12 heroes that night, with Admiral Miwa attending. Sake flowed freely, and the food was the best that could be served. The traditional festive tai, redfish, was the main dish, accompanied by kachi kure, victory chestnuts, as well as all other delicacies our commissary staff could assemble. Next day at 8 a.m., all hands mustered again and sang Kimigayo, our national anthem, after which the Kaiten pilots made a brief visit to a shrine built specially for them. Then, having made sure that bits of hair, fingernail parings, and all earthly possessions had been packed for shipment to their loved ones, the 12 men marched proudly between 2 files of Kaiten trainees to boats that took them out to the 3 waiting submarines. Each pilot stood proudly on his Kaiten, waving his sword about his head, as I-36, I-37 and I-47 moved slowly out of the harbour. A great flotilla of small craft milled about us. Many displayed great white banners with fiery slogans written on them. The crews and passengers shouted good wishes and cheered until they had to turn back in order to conserve the fuel so precious to Japan at that time. American submarines, ironically, were reducing the amount of fuel available to Japanese submarines and the small boats that aided us by sinking tanker after tanker. The few aircraft still at Truk were assigned responsibility for making a reconnaissance of Ulithi for us. On November 16, one of them flew over the atoll. Next day I received a wireless report of what it had seen. The 9-mile-long lagoon had room enough to hold most of the US fleet, and much of it was there. To the north there are about 30 ships, including battleships, the report read. In the centre anchorage there are about 100 transports and other auxiliaries in 2 groups. To the south there are about 50 warships. These appear to be the task forces. They include battleships and carriers. When I showed this to Nishina, he gasped. He was elated and disappointed at the same time. It meant plenty of targets for himself and his comrades, but it could have meant much more to Japan as he saw it, had the High Command listened to him and Kuroki when they first submitted their proposal. All those ships, he exclaimed, "and we have only 8 kaiten for an attack. What an opportunity this could have been." Nishina may have been right. If the Naval General Staff had accepted the kaiten idea in 1943 instead of 1944, Japan might have had hundreds of kaiten ready at Tarawa, Makin, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Majuro, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, and Leyte. The monstrous defeats we endured might have been glorious victories instead. As it turned out, kaiten were based ashore in Japan during the final months of the war. They could just as easily have been stationed at island outposts earlier, before the American assault was mounted in full strength. All this, of course, is mere conjecture. Still, the fact remains that Kuroki, Nishina, and an excellent technician, Mr. Hiroshi Suzukawa, had plans for a workable kaiten weapon ready in January 1943, when Japan's war fortunes were still at a fairly high point, despite the Solomons' losses. Kai-10, in fact, might well have been used with telling effect in that area itself. Only 2 of our submarines, I-36 and I-47, were to attack Ulithi. Sea Dr. Kamimoto was to head I-37 for Kosol Strait in the Palau Islands. We knew the enemy had much shipping there, and Kamimoto was supposed to sink 4 large ships with his kaiten, then sink what else he could with conventional torpedoes. A plane sighted I-37, however, while Kamimoto was manoeuvring for his final approach. Destroyer escorts Reynolds and Conklin were sent out from the Palaus to find the submarine. They did, just about 12 hours before Kamimoto's pilots were to have mounted their weapons for the final run-in. I-37 was sunk. Before I headed south at a smooth 20 knots, our Imperial General Headquarters released communiques making some fantastic claims. One said that our troops had killed or wounded 18,000 enemy troops on Peleliu, while destroying or disabling 200 tanks. Also claimed were the sinkings of a cruiser, 2 destroyers, a submarine, and more than 60 landing craft. Another communique covered the attack on Okinawa that had triggered Aden Toyoda into ordering an all-out submarine attack. It claimed the sinking of 11 enemy aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 1 destroyer. Another 8 carriers, the communique said, were damaged, along with 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 1 destroyer. As for the Philippines, where the combined fleet received its death blow, 3 communiques claimed a total of 14 carriers sunk, along with 6 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and more than 10 transports. With reports like these, it is no wonder that, right up to the final months, most Japanese citizens truly believed that Japan was winning the war. I had both of I-47's radars working while surfaced, and being especially fearful of enemy submarines and aircraft, had 6 lookouts posted on the bridge. But aside from this special alertness, we were a fairly relaxed group. I teased my medical and engineering officers because they seemed to have little work to do. "It is good, though," I told them, "that you 2 are idle. It means I don't have much to worry me, but when you are very busy, I know I am in trouble." We also teased kaiten pilot Fukuda, who was squirming uncomfortably after being at sea a full day. He had not used I-47's complicated toilet because he was too embarrassed to ask someone how it worked. Chief Petty Officer Yukio Oka helped keep spirits up. The son of a Tokyo fish market operator, Oka was a cheerful man of highly competitive spirit. He did not like to lose at anything. He was also quite talented. Besides being very proficient in his main duty as assistant diving officer, he was an accomplished singer who had learned a number of traditional chants handed down in his family. He would often sing them for us. Oka was also something of an amateur artist. Because of his tremendous professional skills and his bright approach to any subject or problem, the crew had great faith in Oka. But he too came in for a share of teasing. While inspecting our kaiten one day, his lifeline parted and he was washed overboard. We had to stop the ship and recover him. Lete Nishina, who kept a daily diary, noted that Oka, in charge of submerged navigation, was too eager and swam 10 minutes in the Pacific Ocean today. When they were not studying the chart of Ulithi Atoll, or recognition silhouettes of enemy ships, the Kaiten men and my officers played chess, cards, and Go. At 3 p.m. on November 17, while running submerged, we picked up propeller sounds. A look through the periscope revealed an American destroyer heading northwest, away from us. At sunset of November 18, I surfaced I-47 about 50 miles west of Ulithi Atoll. For all my years at sea, the moment was one I will never forget. The sea, sky, and submarines seemed to be dripping orange from the brilliant light on the western horizon, and soon the symmetrical Southern Cross appeared in the sky. While the navigator checked our position by celestial observations and my lookouts kept careful watch, K-10 pilots and their maintenance men carefully loosed the first and fourth hold-down band on each weapon. These left only the two center ones to be freed, which could be done by us from inside I-47's hull. The maintenance men were petty officers Kanzo Iwano, Tokizo Kameishi, Fumio Kurokawa, and Seaman Masao Mori. These four men had embarked as technical specialists to make sure that all weapons were kept in good condition. I then steered toward Ulithi and was reminded of my days off San Francisco in December 1941, when the eastern sky had lit up before us. The ships inside Ulithi's lagoon must have been well illuminated to cast such a glow into the sky. 1 hour before sunrise on November 19, I submerged to 180 feet so as to avoid detection from the air. I then edged I-47 in until, at 9:30 a.m., we were 4 miles off Zowario Channel, the southwest entrance to the lagoon. I came up to periscope depth, made a swift sweep, and called out the bearings of 3 cruisers inside the lagoon to my navigator. Then we dived and did not come up to periscope depth again until just before noon. After checking with radar for planes and noting none, I raised the periscope about 4 feet above the surface for a good look. I was then just outside Ulithi's reef. The nearest cruiser was only about 3 miles from me. Beyond her were several battleships and some more cruisers. Beyond those I could see aircraft carriers, with 2 carrier-type planes and a twin-engined seaplane circling above the ships. These were all in the southern area of the lagoon. I could see ships in the central section, moored in several rows. There were ships beyond those too, which I couldn't actually see through my periscope, but whose presence was indicated by thin rising columns of smoke. "Here, Nishina," I said to the senior Kaiten pilot. "Take a look." He, Fukuda, Sato, and Watanabe all took turns at the periscope. They were very elated by what they saw. "A fleet that size could not possibly move out of here in a night," one of them said. And Nishina's diary for that day commented on the golden opportunity to use Kaiten. I-36 was northeast of Ulithi, ranging to within 4 miles of another entrance to make observations, while I was west and southwest of the anchorage. Having finished my visual checks, I ordered I-47 taken to 180 feet once again, and moved out to sea south of the atoll. Although it was time for lunch, I could not eat. I retired to my cabin to meditate for a while. When I left there, I paused at the ship's shrine, located outside my cabin door, before summoning department heads and the Kaiten pilots to the wardroom. "We will launch Kaiten in the morning," I said, "from a point about 4 miles off the eastern opening of the atoll. They will enter through the westernmost of the 2 channels. Targets will be the large-size aircraft carriers in the southern anchorage, or the battleships. In order to avoid having 2 Kaiten attack the same target, and so we can make simultaneous attacks, Lieutenant Nishina will be launched at 4 a.m. He will penetrate the anchorage and go straight ahead as far as he can. Ensign Sato will go off at 4:04. He will move off to the right just after entering. Ensign Watanabe will follow 5 minutes after that. He will go left, and Lieutenant Fukuda, 5 minutes after Watanabe, will seek as large a target as possible near the entrance. Lieutenant Nishina then gave detailed instructions to his comrades on navigation, depth setting for attack, etc., and the pilots retired to their quarters. Lieutenant Fukuda's assistant gave him a haircut. Ensign Sato shaved off what had been a beautiful beard. Ensign Watanabe, who had been quite a dandy at Keio University, devoted his time to becoming extra neat and clean. I let all four use some of our precious fresh water for showers. Then they dressed in neatly ironed shirts and bound white sashes over their uniforms around their waists. Joining me in the wardroom, the four men wrote the last words each wanted to leave behind. Chief Oka then produced a sketch he had been making, drawn with soft black pencil in varying shades. It showed an American aircraft carrier breaking in two as a kaiten collided with it. More than a dozen planes were sliding off the flight deck into the sea. The kaiten pilots were most pleased with this surprise. All autographed it, and Nishina wrote "Gochin," meaning instantly sunk, under his signature. That evening at dinner, a fine sake, a gift from the Emperor, was served in specially prepared lacquerware cups. Then the pilots retired to get what rest they could. I waited until 90 minutes after sunset, then took I-47 to the surface. At a speed of 12 knots, I approached Ulithi. There was no need to take a star sight. The atoll sky was bright, like a coastal city's in peacetime. While I-47 recharged batteries, I told myself that the presence of all those lights meant the enemy had no idea we were anywhere near.